Hey there everyone, I'm Luke and today we're breaking down the very first episode of Marvel Studios' What If. This is the very first animated series set within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Or should I say Marvel Cinematic Multiverse? This series explores the multiverse of the Marvel Cinematic Universe versions of these characters and these stories. This is a brand new animated series coming out weekly on Disney+. And at the end of the previous Marvel series set within the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Loki, we see the creation of the multiverse, the timelines branching off, creating different variants and different timelines and different universes. And this show explores some of the many different universes that have been created in that show's wake. Each show in this series asks a very simple question: what if? The first episode being, what if Captain Carter were the first Avenger? And this is a very simple premise, one that definitely helps ease the viewers into the show, because this episode is very much basically Captain America the First Avenger, the movie from 2011, just told from a different point of view. What if one thing was changed, and how would the rest of that film play out? Apparently, as the show progresses, some of the concepts are going to get a little bit more wilder, and some of those changes that are made are going to have far bigger ramifications than we saw here. But I do think this was a very strong opening episode, which was a very fun look at a fan favourite character taking on a new role. And I do think the framing of the episode basically being a new version of that original film really helps clearly set up that this isn't just some random multiverse. No, this is very much a multiverse based off of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And now I do want to say that this is going to be a full episode breakdown. If you have not seen it yet, what are you doing? Go watch it. It's fantastic, because this video is going to contain spoilers galore. Now, before we get started, please can I ask you to hit that like button. It really helps out the channel and lets it get seen by so many more people. Now, there are 9 episodes of this series, and I'm going to be doing an episode weekly, breaking everything down. So if you want to stick around and see more of these, hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell to be notified the next time we dive down the tube of Toons and break down some what if. Now, as I said up top, this episode is basically very derivative of the original Captain America the First Avenger movie, and I've got to say that is still one of my favourite Marvel movies. It's certainly my favourite film from the phase 1 of the MCU, and it was so nice to revisit it here. I knew going in this episode was going to be very closely inspired by that film, and so I actually rewatched that film last night before watching this episode, and I do think that was definitely the right decision, because it meant so much more when I saw all the different callbacks. So the series does start us off with sort of setting up the show, as we do hear Watu the Watcher narrating his little spiel about the multiverse and setting up this episode by basically establishing that we are about to watch the events of Captain America the First Avenger. He tells us that in the original timeline, Steve Rogers takes the super soldier serum to become Captain America. And then we see that scene play out from the original movie in animated form of Skinny Steve becoming Hench Steve. And so very clearly from the get-go, we understand that we are placed in that movie, and we're picking up around 30 minutes into the movie, which is when Steve becomes Cap. And as we haven't had that one small change yet, we can assume that the first 30 minutes of that movie are pretty much canon to this episode. And then Watu says, but what if we made one change? And that is the moment when Dr. Erskine asks if Agent Carter would like to take a step out of the room, which in the original film we presume is for her safety. Everybody takes a step out of the room and watches from the viewing platform, and there she perfectly obliges. But in this version of events, she says no, she takes a stand, and it very much feels like a moment of female empowerment. She's like, no, the woman will stay in the room. But as you can see here, that once Agent Carter decides that she's going to be staying in the room, so does everyone else, including the Hydra agent who kills Dr. Erskine in the original film. Well, here he makes his play before Steve's transformation. He shoots Colonel Chester Phillips and Steve Rogers himself, as well as setting off an explosion which kills Dr. Erskine. But the Super Soldier Serum project was already underway. The power had already started, and someone had to go in. With everyone else seeming unwilling or just simply wanting to push buttons, Peggy takes Steve's place, and instead of getting Captain America, we get Captain Carter. And from here we basically see the events of the original Captain America movie play out from this now unique perspective of Peggy with the powers. Obviously in the original film, Steve is sent on his USO tour, but Peggy is already quite high up in the SSR, and so rather than being sent off straight away into propaganda mode, she actually sticks around, and that is where she hears about Hydra's trip to Norway, where they steal the Tesseract. Now this is a scene that we also saw in the original movie. I will say in the original movie we see it happen a lot earlier on, before Steve's transformation, but at the same time the timeline of the events in the original film were never super clearly laid out, and it's quite possible that that was just an introduction to the villain before jumping back to see Steve's origin unfold. Now this is a slightly shorter version of the scene from that movie, and I've seen a few people online speculate that it's a different version of that scene. For instance, the caretaker is killed a little bit earlier in the scene than he is in the movie. The Red Skull has a bit of a longer monologue, which sure it is a difference, but I don't think it's really an important difference. The message of that scene was essentially the same, and I do think it was simply a shorter scene. This is simply a 30-minute episode. And so when Peggy learns about this, we get our debut of Captain Carter as she goes to Berlin to intersect Hydra, and that's where they capture Arnim Zola and the Tesseract. And this is another one of those things where we see the knock-on effects of this one small change. Because she captured Zola and the Tesseract so early, he's never able to go on and create all of his experiments that we see later. Hydra doesn't have all this super high-tech weaponry we see them develop in the original film. And most importantly, in the scene where Captain Carter goes behind enemy lines and rescues the 107 from capture, Bucky is in the cells with the rest of the future Howling Commandos, isn't being experimented on by Arnim Zola with the Tesseract, because Arnim Zola and the Tesseract are not there in that facility. So that whole sequence from the original film is in this episode, but it ends up being a lot shorter because Cap doesn't have to go and diversion, save Bucky separately. And it's just lots of little things like that, a lot of attention to detail where if this one change happened, how would that realistically affect the story? And I do think it's done fantastically here. They haven't just very literally taken the film and put Peggy in Steve's place. No, they've actually thought, how would her being in this position actually affect the story in different ways? There's also a great scene how we see the difference of how Peggy thinks she has just lost Steve would interrogate Zola as opposed to Colonel Chester, and her approach may have been a little bit more effective in actually getting correct information out of him. I also think it's really fun and interesting to see just exactly what happens when Howard Stark gets his hands on the Tesseract. He's able to build this Iron Man-like armour, much like the original Iron Man Mark 1 or the Ironmonger suit, and he creates the Hydra Stomper armour, which he gives to Steve. Yes, skinny Steve still stays in the story and he fights by Peggy's side, and I think it's fantastic to see, although I do think that's one element that doesn't quite mesh up with the main Marvel Cinematic Universe timeline. Of course, Howard Stark did eventually find the Tesseract, and he never built an Iron Man suit. The war is over, so maybe you could argue that's why he built it. He had a bigger motivation to help Steve fight, but also Howard Stark didn't build the Iron Man suit. No, that was all Tony Stark and of course Ho Yinsen, the scientist he met in the cave. You know, I get it, they're creating parallels between Tony and his father, but I do think they're giving Howard a little bit more credit there. He was long dead when Tony created the armour, so maybe that's a bit of a minor nitpick. It's more than just one small change, it's quite a big change really, but who cares? It's really fun and it works in this episode. And we don't just get references to the first Avenger in this episode. No, we also get some references to the Agent Carter one-shot that was released on the Iron Man 3 Blu-ray, because one of the main characters featured in this episode is Colonel John Flynn. As I mentioned, Colonel Chester Phillips, who is one of the main characters from this original film, he is killed pretty much straight away, most likely because they couldn't get Tommy Lee Jones back. I think his inclusion is fantastic here. He was a thorn to Peggy's side in that one shot, and so it works very well that he's playing the same role here. While on that note, I would like to say that last week, in an episode of Marvel Legends that was created to catch viewers up to speed on the history of Peggy, they did confirm that the Agent Carter one-shot is canon to the main MCU timeline, which of course means that the Agent Carter TV series, which contradicted the one-shot, is not part of canon. If the one-shot is canon, the series is not. This means that this version of Peggy is actually the second variant of the MCU character that we have seen, as the version in the Agent Carter TV series is most likely another variant in a different timeline where events played out slightly differently for that character. And it's also possible that we've seen another variant of Peggy that may or may not have been pruned. And while this film doesn't give Peggy her own USO tour, we do get many references to it. We have a character state that they could be putting her on a USO tour, and then later Howard Stark gives her her suit, much like he gives Cap his final suit in the original movie. But here he says it's actually a modified version of her USO suit, which is a fun nod to how Cap had a really campy suit in his USO tour before he modified it to help save Bucky, and then eventually getting a completely new armoured Kevlar-esque suit from Howard, and it is a fantastic costume. The original film does give us actually two montages, the first being the USO montage, and then a montage of once he's become Captain America, we see him fighting Hydra agents throughout the course of the war, before we skip to the end of the war, where he loses Bucky and gets frozen in ice. Well, this episode plays out in a very similar way. Rather than the USO montage, we get the fight in Berlin. We get her and Steve rescuing the Howling Commandos, and then we get the montage of Peggy, Steve, and the Howling Commandos fighting Hydra throughout the course of the war, before we get to the scene where Cap originally lost Bucky, and the final scene where he gets frozen in ice. We get all that, but the montage here, because it's only one montage, not two, it really does combine the best of both of those montages. I said myself, I love this original film, but one of the biggest complaints many people give it is the fact that it does have those two montages, and the more heavily criticised of the two is the second montage. That's what they really wanted to see the film be about, just Cap fighting Hydra, and they feel like the film skipped over the bulk of the war just to rush to get him into present day. And while that still happens here, it's a lot more forgivable. Firstly, because yes, it's a 30-minute episode that is playing on the original film, so it sort of gets a pass for just copying the film in a more condensed fashion. But at the same time, the fact that it is the only montage in the film, not the second of two, really works in this episode's favour. In the film, the first montage of the USO tour is heavily stylized and really works in the film and really helps put it in the 1940s setting, whereas the second montage, as action-packed as it is fairly generic and it doesn't really have much stylization to it. Well, with this episode only featuring the one montage, they are able to take that 1940s stylization and place it into this second montage, which instantly makes the montage feel that bit more interesting, because this is a combination of Cap and Steve fighting through the war with the 1940s newsreel and interviews interjected into it to help give us that 1940s setting. You see some really dynamic punches where the background changes. That makes us think of like classic comic books and movie serials from that time. It's really exciting to see, and makes a montage that still is skipping over pretty much the entirety of the war seem that much more visually interesting. You've got the shots themselves. The way Captain Carter fights in this episode and throughout the episode, not just this montage, but in this montage specifically, I think it's really well highlighted. The way she moves is so athletic, it's so dynamic, it's so acrobatic. She moves so skillfully and so thought out, like a dancer, like a ballerina. She's so graceful but so powerful in the way that she fights that it's just a pleasure to watch. And it's something that, as great as Chris Evans was in the role, it's something that they probably couldn't capture in live action. The way she moves here is so carefully thought out that I don't think we've ever seen in a Marvel movie before. Is it because it's animated? Is it just because they have better storyboarders and choreographers in this show? I am leaning towards the earlier. I think animation allows you to do bigger things a lot more easily. Something which, if you were doing it in live action, sure, you could do it, but it would have been incredibly VFX heavy, which of course is a lot harder to do in live action when you're trying to make it look photoreal. Whereas with animation, you can get away with a lot more. For instance, it's not much harder to animate a throwing a motorcycle than it is to animate a throwing a shield, whereas it's a lot easier to do the shield in live action. All in all, the montage really works here. Another thing I really want to touch on is how this episode really cements that Steve and Peggy are just meant to be together. Even in this universe where events play out differently, they still end up seeking each other out. They have a very similar dynamic to what they have in the first film. Sure, there's a little bit of a role reversal, but it's great to see how their relationship plays out here in a very similar way. In fact, you could argue that the relationship progresses further here than it did in the original movie. You still get all the references to them wanting to dance, the way that's set up, and how the dancing banter starts is different, but it still feels true to the original spirit. It's just nice to think that in every universe, he still owes her that dance. Which, of course, it shouldn't be that much of a shock. If you watch the original film, they definitely fall for each other before his transformation happens, and so before this episode happens. So of course they were still going to like each other here, but it's nice to see that even without him making that change, they still would have been kept close enough to one another that that relationship was allowed to continue to blossom. Because it's very easy to believe that if he never became Steve, she never would have seen him again afterwards. But that doesn't happen here. They're able to carry on being friends, and to the point that they become maybe more. And this is where I want to talk about the voice actors. I think they all did a fantastic job here. This episode pretty much has the all-star MCU voice cast. There's only one actor that doesn't return from live action, that of course being Chris Evans himself as Steve Rogers. But no, here he is played by Josh Keaton of Spectacular Spider-Man fame. He was, of course, the voice of Peter on that show. And he's also done loads of other superhero things over the years. He was the voice of Hal Jordan on Green Lantern, the animated series. Well, here he's Steve Rogers. And I've got to say, he was a dead ringer for Chris Evans. There was maybe one or two lines where you could tell it was a different person. But on the whole, he very much sounded like Evans. And of course, he's a master of voice acting. And he probably gave one of the best performances in the episode. You can tell he's comfortable behind the mic. And it was perfect for what the episode needed. Whereas some of the live action actors, you could tell they weren't super experienced in this type of acting. Not that the performances were bad, but some of them were just lacking that extra sparkle that helps a voice acting performance really stand out. You know, it's incredible that in a live action acting setting, a certain voice can work, but in animation, it just kind of falls a little bit more flat. Hayley Atwell, as the lead of the episode, did a pretty much fantastic job. There was only one or two lines where I thought that delivery could have had a little bit more oomph to it. Not that it was ever bad, it was just sometimes a little bit flatter than it could have been when comparing it to Josh Keaton as Chris. One person I do want to mention is Sebastian Stan. He's back as Bucky Barnes, and I'm gonna be honest, at first when I was listening to it, I didn't realise it was him. Now, it very much is the same actor that plays him in live action, but he does sound different here. And I think that's because he is actually doing a really good job at voice acting. It works incredibly well for the role, but I think he's putting that much life into his performance that it almost doesn't sound like the same character. Of course, it's the same voice, it's the same actor, but there's that much more life in it, which is perfect for animation, that for some reason it just didn't compute that it was the same voice. He sounds so different, even though it is the same actor. It's kind of odd. All credit to him. This is one of the only times we've ever got to see Bucky before he became the Winter Soldier. Yes, he was in that original film, but he doesn't have a super loud role. And while he's a lot happier than he is in the later movies, this happy-go-lucky version of the character isn't something we're really used to seeing. And so I think it just stands out different here. It doesn't read as Bucky straight away. Outside of that, everyone is pretty much the original actors from the original movie. Of course, I mentioned that Colonel Flynn from the Agent Carter one-shot is back, and he's being voiced by Bradley Whitford, who played him in that short, so it's great to see him return to the MCU here. But then we have Red Skull, or Johann Schmidt, who in the original film was played by Hugo Weaving. Here he is played by Ross Marquand, but he did of course play the character in Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame, so he's not new to the role, but he isn't from the original film. And we even get a cameo at the end from Samuel L. Jackson and Jeremy Renner as Nick Fury and Hawkeye, which does bring me into the ending. I like the way that this episode ended. in a very similar way to how the original film ended, with Peggy sacrificing herself to save the world and help win the war. And I think it was perhaps even more emotional than in the original film. Of course, we have the whole baggage of watching the original movies and seeing their relationship from start to end. But the fact that Steve and Peggy were in the same room when they were having their final conversation, when they were planning that dance that they both knew was never going to happen. Oh, the feels watching that scene, so good. And I also liked how it was different. The reason behind her sacrifice, her disappearance, and her eventual return in present day, or in, I presume, in 2012, it's different, but it really works. Of course, that ties into the ramifications of the Red Skull not having the Tesseract all throughout the movie. He only gets it at a later point, and so he doesn't have the exact same plan. He isn't just disappearing. The Space Stone doesn't just transport him to Vormir. No, here he uses it to unleash a creature, a plan which is his undoing, as this creature then kills him. And it's great to see Captain Carter fight this monster. We see her using this sword. I presume it's some sort of Norse Asgardian sword, as the Red Skull is obsessed with the Norse mythology. And there's just the shots of her fighting with the shield and the sword, and it's awesome. And of course, I've got to say, it reminds me of Wonder Woman. I mean, it is of course how Peggy and Steve are reunited together, because the earlier scene where we lost Bucky in the original film, in this version of events, Peggy thought she lost Steve and we felt for her, but of course he was alive. They were reunited, only for her to be ripped away from him once again. It was such a powerful moment. I loved every minute of it. I thought it was so fantastic. Now, I'm not entirely sure on the logistics of what happened. It appears that Peggy got trapped in the Tesseract in presumably this sort of alternate dimension, and that dimension seemed to freeze her in time, because the final scene of the episode actually recreates the opening scene from the first Avengers movie. When they switch on the Tesseract, rather than Loki coming through the portal, we get Peggy, and she's not aged a day. Has she been frozen in time? Does time work differently in this different dimension? It's not 100% clear, but either way, Peggy ends up in modern day Avengers era, and I'm definitely intrigued to see what is going to happen for the future of this character. In a way, it kind of reminded me of how Captain America and the Red Skull were frozen in time in this alternate dimension back in Spider-Man the animated series from the 90s. That series really had to juggle around the concept of characters dying, and so in that series Captain America never died, he was just lost in time, and we saw a few different instances of the character being broken out of the interdimensional space that he and the Red Skull were trapped in, and that's just what it reminded me of. I don't know if they were actually pulling from that, but it definitely reminded me of that, the way that Cap is sort of trapped in this other dimension. And that's why you did hear me speculate about the future of this character, which is where we're going to get into a bit of speculation. And while none of this is confirmed, I don't know anything, I've not seen any future episodes, I don't have any inside industry information. There's a lot of speculation, but a lot of things seem to be lining up, and there may be some minor spoilers ahead. So if you don't want to know anything about the future of this series or the MCU as a whole, you might want to skip this chapter. Just look on the video timeline for the next chapter or in the description, or click the next time code in the description, or just simply end the video. It's up to you. Now, there's been a lot of talk that this is an anthology series, that each individual episode is going to be following a different storyline, a different what if question, which makes sense. That's sort of how the what if comic series goes. It is an anthology title, but I don't think Disney has ever claimed that this is an anthology series. And I do think that while at least the earlier episodes are going to be separate, I do think that the series may be building towards something more. Captain Carter has been the flagship title for this series. She's been on all the posters front and centre, and I think this might not be the last we see of her. While the team behind the series have said that they would like to bring her back in season 2 and explore the future of her timeline and her universe, but there have been clips of the character featured within the trailers for this series that simply did not take place within this episode. We see this clip of her with Doctor Strange. Presumably the Doctor Strange Supreme character has his own individual episode, as well as there are other clips where we see this Doctor Strange Supreme alongside Star-Lord. Are they all going to meet up? Well, in this just released Hyundai commercial, which yes is specially animated for the commercial features a few of these characters fighting alongside one another. You see Captain Carter alongside Doctor Strange Supreme, the T'Challa Star-Lord, as well as Party Thor, all battling Ultron robots, with Watu watching over them. We even see him bringing Party Thor into the battle, and that just reminded me of the closing line of this episode, where Watu states that he just watches, he doesn't interfere, for now. Does that mean this series is building to some sort of crossover between all the individual characters? Are they eventually going to meet up? And is he going to use his powers to bring them together to cross dimensions? And is that going to be some sort of big finale? Is this series its own mini phase of the MCU that builds up to an Avengers style crossover? I'm not entirely sure, but if so, that would be fantastic, sort of mirroring phase 1, and it more than makes sense to do it in a Marvel Cinematic Universe show. And not only that, we do know that now that the multiverse has been opened at the end of Loki, we're going to be in some multiversal madness in Doctor Strange 2, as well as possibly in Spider-Man No Way Home, both coming out in the next year. And it's going to be interesting, if we do truly cross the multiverse in those movies, will we be seeing any of the characters introduced within this show in a live action format? Well, it's been heavily rumoured in the last few weeks that that may be the case, in particular with Hayley Atwell reprising her role as Captain Carter from this series. And if that is going to be the case, I could not be more excited. I absolutely love this character, and I would love to see more from her in the future, particularly in a live action setting. Now I know what you're thinking, Luke, I thought you aren't a big fan of Disney's live action remakes and bringing animated characters into live action. Peggy was originally a live action character, and it was fantastic to see her animated here, but I certainly am not going to have a problem if they take her back into live action, as it's where this version of the character comes from. And that makes us think about, what is the future of this series? What is the future of this character? And that's pretty much it, guys. I absolutely love this show. I love this first episode. We've been talking for a long time now, and I've not even had a chance to talk about the look of the show, about the animation style. And considering that we've done a lot of setup for the series this week, I think I'm going to leave that all till next week. But so all I'm going to say for now is that I like it. But stay tuned, because I'm going to be telling you all about my thoughts on that next week. I also want to take this moment to touch on Marvel Legends. It's a series of 7-minute shorts catching people up on characters within the MCU. They've been doing different episodes all year to tie into the releases of different TV shows and movies. For WandaVision, they did one for WandaVision, they did one for Bucky and Falcon, one for Loki, one for Black Widow. Well, for this series, last week they released 2 episodes that tied into this first episode, one on Peggy Carter and one on the Tesseract, but they also released one on the Ravagers, which is to set up next week's episode, as of course next week is going to be the T'Challa Star-Lord episode, where what if Yondu took T'Challa as a child rather than Peter Quill? And so we're going to see T'Challa as a Ravager, with T'Challa of course being voiced by Chadwick Boseman. It's going to be some of his final performances as the character, and we know that he's recorded at least 4 episodes for the series. I'm not sure if they're all in season 1 or whether maybe 1 or 2 of them are in season 2. I think it's going to be similar to playing out the events of the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie, and that's why I would recommend that if you want to get hyped for next week, rewatch the first movie. Hopefully they're going to continue to release different episodes of Marvel Legends so that we know what to get up to speed on, what to rewatch before we watch each episode. And I'm going to try and keep you up to date to the best of my knowledge on what's to come and how to get hyped for the next episode in each weekly installment of these What If breakdowns. And that is pretty much everything I've got to say. I've had a blast breaking down this episode, and I hope you have too. Did you like this episode? What stories, what questions do you want the series to explore? Let me know in a comment down below, because I'd love to talk to some of you about it. I absolutely love this episode, and I've loved breaking it down for you. If you enjoyed it, please hit that like button to let me know. And if you want to keep up to date with every What If breakdown as they come out each week, why don't you do me a favour and hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell to be notified the next time we dive down the tube of tunes and break down some What If. Alright everyone, thanks for watching. Cheers. Thanks for watching Tube of Tunes. If you want more from the channel, hit subscribe. If you want to keep up to date with what's going on, follow us on our socials. Hope you liked it. Cheers.